and I would like to welcome all participating in this symposium, and in particular, of course, those who have accepted our invitation to be part of this first panel. We have 5 contributions or contributors to this panel, and we should always have a look at the watch so that we don't take more time than given to us. We have to complete this first session in 1 hour's time, which will give us 10 minutes for each contributor, and then about almost 10 minutes for discussion. I think the previous speaker, the keynote speaker, Jacobs, has opened the discussion for our symposium in a very interesting manner, showing problems that have obviously occurred in the so-called peace process, and he has also shown ways how to overcome these difficulties, and I think looking at these ways will also prompt us to ask who are the stakeholders, what positions do they have, what are their interests, and this is the main topic of this first panel. I think we can follow the order as it's stated in the program. So we will start with Jeffrey Smith, who is a professor at the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs at Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada, and he has been involved in matters of the Western Sahara for long, and I noted also with interest that he has worked in areas that I think are very interesting for comparison. I refer to your work for East Timor. Jeffrey, with this, I think I give you the floor, and please make your contribution.
Thank you, and a real expression of gratitude to Professor Mundy for his remarks, for taking time in his busy schedule at the end of an academic season to join us and give us a framework of analysis and discussion. It is an honor to appear at the same event as you. Thank you for that kind introduction. I, of course, as we say to students, I confess my bias or orientation in the following presentation. I am a jurist. My lens of viewing the Western Sahara conflict is one in law. Nevertheless, allow me to try to make some economic conclusions for us in a way that perhaps guides our discussions. I'll ask you to hold 2 constructs, if you will, in mind, and I'll come back to them in a few minutes' time when I conclude. We might remind ourselves on these 2 constructs that there's a great deal of international law that applies to the situation or question of Western Sahara, beginning with the point that much of it has been settled. We sometimes say simplistically to students, there's not much new in international law when it comes to Western Sahara. As Senator Galan reminded us, we've been more than 60 years of living with and understanding the basic foundational principle of the right to self-determination. What more could be new? But there are new applications, of course, and for scholars, there are nuances in the law that Western Sahara continues to reveal, and maybe perhaps in questions in discussion a little later on in this panel, we'll get to some of them. But those 2 sources of law, to be plain, are the law of self-determination, and secondly, the law of occupation, or, as we put it, international humanitarian law. And we might bear them in mind. It has been the law of self-determination that has guided us, the United Nations, the community of states, and indeed the work of civil society and NGOs in the pursuit of justice in Western Sahara. It has been much less the law of occupation until recently. And we have some opportunities to explore that, and as Professor Mundy reminds us, potentially to pursue it in service of some of the greater political strategies that would now be employed after a resumption of the conflict. So just bear those two streams or sources of obligations in the international order or realm in mind. There are really three things I can say touching on the topic of how the European Union as a community, as states, as organizations across Council, Commission, and Parliament engage Western Sahara. And they are, firstly, a brief recapitulation or a history of the economic trade ties that affect or connect with Western Sahara in the modern era. Secondly, I'll make the point that it's not really about the money. It's not about the apparent economic importance of those ties. And I'll explain that. It's perhaps controversial. Some of the other panelists will, I think, perhaps illuminate it in a way that allows for discussion. And then I'll briefly offer a summary of, in law, where some of the challenges to these trade arrangements are going. Most of us here in today's seminar know the essential facts of the economic and trade relationship between Europe as a community and Morocco with respect to occupied Western Sahara. We can itemize very briefly what the particular resources, activities, goods, and services are which flow to and from Western Sahara. They're easily enumerated, and I'll try to put some current values to them in order to make my second point a little bit more clear. Those resources are undeniably and consistently over the past 33 or 34 years, notably since Spain joined the European community in 1986 toward a shift of its fisheries arrangements in 1988, surrendering those into a now common fisheries policy. Those resources are, first of all, the fishery. I would put the general commercial or market value of that European fishery, now under a renewed fisheries partnership agreement between Brussels and Morocco, at around 100 million euros annually. That is a different figure than what is paid out of Brussels to Morocco for the fishery rent. But in general, given the level of activity, the value of the fishery, it would seem to be in the range of about 100 million euros. There is, secondly, no longer a trade in phosphate rock out of occupied Western Sahara into Europe. That ended in 2018 with a final shipment into Lithuania. And we feel that shipments of a high value commodity, a very useful agricultural fertilizer commodity, have likely been ended because of the legal line drawn around that activity or resource by the Sahrawi Republic in its 2017 cases in Panama and South Africa. And we might get into some discussion about those and some opportunities further. There is no longer a trade in phosphate mineral rock into Europe, and we can't presume that it would readily begin. This leaves a variety of much smaller value resources that are in play: agricultural products, sand or aggregate that is shipped to Spain, and as yet, not yet, any petroleum or, of course, mineral extraction on land. Similarly, the trade in services between European states, European corporations, and Western Sahara is relatively limited, except for the development of solar and wind energy. And of course, we've seen much activity around that from the Western Sahara Resource Watch organization, challenging Siemens in Germany in particular. I would mark that trade as somewhere perhaps in the 25 to no more than 50 million euro range. So what does all this mean? That trade is important, but not on an economic level. Trade is symbolic for both partners in this relationship, the European Union as such, and Morocco. We know from the documentary record that the trade is pursued significantly by Morocco, a Western Sahara-oriented trade, in order to secure or concretize its diplomatic and civil society relationships into Europe. The record is now quite clear on that. We know similarly that the broader or wider project around a Euro-Mediterranean prospect that Brussels has is to engage Morocco, and that trade, economic activity is one device for that. But trade does not count for much. Even if you are critical of the figures I offer and suggest that trade or the volume of services is significantly higher into the 200, 300 million euro a year range, annual range, let me hold up this fact to make my second point. The occupation itself of Western Sahara is substantially more costly to Morocco. The basic military cost out of Morocco's treasury to garrison Western Sahara, I would put at not less than 1 billion euros annually. There's not much transparency around that. How do we assign a cost to it? In other words, my point is the exercise of trade generally for Morocco out of Western Sahara, and in particular with the European Union, the European community, is far outpaced or outstripped by the cost to maintain a presence in Western Sahara. And we should remember that. It's perhaps a point to exploit at some point, or at least understand more fully. This brings me very briefly, Mr. Chair, into the legal challenges that have proceeded. And there's a very good article out in the Journal of North African Legal Studies by David Condini, which makes clear some of things. He explains it in very clear terms in a recently published article. There have been, I guess now, 12 cases that have pursued economic activity and trade generally out of occupied Western Sahara in recent years. And the phenomenon is interesting. It's a turn to applying the law where there is an international or other legal connection into Western Sahara. And that is notably on the question of trade and resources. And paradoxically, not in what should count, which are matters of human rights, or indeed the core question of self-determination. In other words, there is...
Please mind the watch.
Yeah. In other words, there is a vulnerability around resources and trade that continues to offer opportunities. So we see 9 cases pursued by the Polisario Front in the European Court, with 2 of them now joined and, as has been said, pending decision in July. And we can discuss the prospects around that case and what is different about them as challenges to trade and the fisheries agreement. There is a 10th case settled and returned to the United Kingdom. Then there are the 2017 Panama, South Africa cases. And then finally, the newest, a recent case in New Zealand brings us to 13. And then finally, a case in the United Kingdom by a Solidarity NGO challenging the United Kingdom trade agreements now directly with Morocco. So we're in an interesting era of beginning to apply law around the basic principles of international law. My concluding point is this, returning to the sources of law. if we can't move in law to greater definition and a compelling of governments and corporations on the issue of self-determination law, then perhaps we might have recourse or begin to build a foundation in international humanitarian law, recalling the criminal nature of the plunder of resources and the obligations that law has around protection of a civil population under occupation. So we come to those points which represent opportunities in spite of the tragedy, or perhaps because of the tragedy, of a return to conflict. And we'll have some more discussion as the panel unfolds.
Thank you very much, Jeffrey, for your contribution. I think we should just go ahead with our panel so that we somehow remain within the framework of time. I have received an email from Tim Sauer, and he asked whether he should not come in now, because what he has to tell us is somehow related to what Jeffrey has just explained to us. I think, Tim, we can do this, and I hope that the other panelists will accept this. So Tim Sauer works with the institution which was already mentioned by Jeffrey in his contribution, Western Sahara Resource Watch, and he will now just continue focusing on some points which are more closely related to the relationship of German companies and Western Sahara. Tim, please come in now and have the watch in mind, so that we remain somehow with the time given to us. Tim, welcome.
Thank you, Manfred. But yeah, no ways I wanted to force myself in here. Okay, yeah, thanks for Freiheit for the Westsahara for organizing this conference, and for inviting a Resource Watch for a talk. I will dig in a bit further into the topic of resources, as it has been touched already by Jeffrey, and its importance on the whole conflict. Can you just confirm that you can see my my screen now? Can you see my presentation?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot. So yeah, being reminded time, I will maybe skip a bit my introductory part, and I will just, tell you that the role of economic activities, as it has already been explained by Jeffrey, goes far beyond than being just a source of revenue for the Moroccan occupation. So actually there is a whole spectrum of interest that Morocco pursues in relation with economic activities in Western Sahara. And my point is that actually all these interests are served by German companies. As you can see, the most famous one gathered here together, like Siemens Energy, Heidelberg Cement. So really huge stock-listed multinationals which are operating in Western Sahara. So one of the main interests of Morocco is, of course, financing the occupation. So the occupation needs a lot of money, as Jeffrey just has said. So it needs money for the infrastructure, for the security services, for army, police, tax incentives, for the whole settlement policy. They need a whole lot of money. So where do they get it from? For example, of course, from the phosphate exports. So around about $100 to $200 million a year, or maybe even more, depending on the price of the phosphate. So although there's no direct imports of phosphates into Europe, there are still a lot of German companies who actually help Morocco in exploiting the phosphates. So for example, we have Oldendorf Carriers, which is a shipping company that's transported roughly 60,000 tons of phosphate to New Zealand last year. The famous conveyor belt that transport the phosphate rock from the Phos-Bukra site to the coast that you can see here on the right-hand side. was actually built by ThyssenKrupp in 1973, still under Spanish colonial rule. And ThyssenKrupp is still supplying and maintaining mining equipment for the Forsbruch graphite. The belt facility itself, so the rubber and those parts, were actually provided by Continental, also a German multinational. And it was actually supplying spare parts still until early this year. And there's, of course, Siemens involved, who is actually with his thermal wind park powering most of the Bruch graphite. On the other hand, we have, for example, the fish, of course, and there Bremen plays quite a big role, as there is located the company Costa Marine Proteins, who actually imports the biggest share of fish meal into the European Union from Western Sahara via the port of Bremen. So according to government statistics, roughly 35 million tons of fish meal worth roughly 40 million euros have been imported via Bremen between 2017 and 2019. And all these products, of course, imported and labeled as Moroccan goods. On the other hand, Morocco needs to stabilize its occupation. So as you all know, most of the people living right now in Western Sahara are actually Moroccan settlers. And part of this settlement policy, which according to the research services of the German Parliament, substantiate a violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention, are infrastructure programs. And you need a lot of cement for infrastructure programs. And Heidelberg Cement, the big German multinational, provides most of this concrete. It operates 2 of the 3 grinding mills or cement factories in Western Sahara. One is the Simsud mill and one is the Simar mill, which you can actually see here at the background picture. And the Simsud mill was actually provided by ThyssenKrupp 2 years ago. And its capacity is of around 500,000 tons per year. So just to give you a picture of how much that is, you can compare it to the figures from Germany, where in 2019, roughly 30 million tons of cement have been produced. So if you take more or less the same proportion, inhabitants, cement, the cement only provided by one of the factories of Heidelberg Cement would correspond roughly to 1.5 million inhabitants. So this gives you an idea on how important the cement provided by Heidelberg Cement is for the settlement policy of Morocco in Western Sahara. And of course, Morocco tries to implicate international actors in the occupation through economic relations. So this goes on one side, as we've also heard, through trade agreements with states or with the European Union. On the other side, directly with the companies. So, for example, Siemens or its subsidiaries, Siemens Energy and Siemens Gamesa in Spain, are actually more or less related to all wind energy projects in Western Sahara. So they deal with the occupying power, and this is, of course, kind of an indirect recognition of the sovereignty of Morocco over Western Sahara. So Siemens does exactly what Morocco wants. In the press release from last year, they speak of the southern provinces when they speak about Western Sahara. And so does also Heidelberg Cement and DHL. They all locate El Ayoun in Morocco. Linked to the renewable energies is, of course, always the king himself. So this is one of the biggest interests as well, of course, his personal economic interest. Siemens' business partner in Western Sahara is Nareva, who is more or less completely owned by the king or by the royal family. So by this, the person who is politically responsible for the occupation can actually personally profit from it. And this is what Siemens makes possible. So the good thing about the whole thing is that if we challenge these economic activities, we can challenge the whole conditions that make the occupation possible. So putting on pressure on the companies can have an effect. And we have seen this on an international level. We have seen this for a lot of years already. And we're starting to see also some victories in Germany. So for example, Continental has withdrawn from Western Sahara after decades of involvement early this year, after a lot of pressure from investors, from civil society, even Polisario, and we had media coverage and even political representatives insisting on the company. Then, for example, the Norwegian asset manager Storebrand excluded Siemens Energy from its portfolio over international law concerns in Western Sahara. And just now this week, the UN private US pension fund, Westpath, has issued a counter motion for the AGM of Heidelberg Cement, which will be held more or less in 2 weeks.
Tim, please mind
yes,
watch.
I'm finishing. This is my last slide.
Thank you. Thank you.
So yeah, what we need, that's what I want to say. What we need is protest. We need a lot of protest everywhere. And what we also need is a clear political framework. So we need, for example, focusing on Germany, from the German government, we need a clear warning to companies operating in Western Sahara. We need a stop of imports of goods that come from Western Sahara without the clear consent of the Sahrawi people. And I have to underline also the responsibility of the Federal State of Bremen to take actions against the imports of fish meal. We need the German government to use its influence in DHL, where the German government-owned development bank KfW has shares. And on EU level, we need the government to engage in order to exclude Western Sahara from EU-Morocco trade deals, and we need sanctions for companies operating in Western Sahara, just as we have on Crimea. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Tim, for your contribution and the very important facts you have given to us about the involvement of German companies in Western Sahara. We now jump a bit away from what we have started with. The next presenter in our panel will be Dr. Irene Fernandez Molina. She is a senior lecturer in international relations at the University of Exeter in the United Kingdom. And she has worked on different aspects of Western Sahara. And as I understood from communication exchanged in preparing our conference, she will talk more about Sahrawi activism in Morocco. I hope this is correct. At least this is what you wrote to me. Okay, thank you very much for joining us. Irene, the floor is yours. And I'm sorry for looking at the watch, but I think we have to. We have quite a big program ahead of us, and so have the watch in mind. Thank you very much. Your 10 minutes.
Okay, thanks very much. Thank you, Manfred. Thank you to the organizers, to Judith in particular for having me. I thought I would talk about Sagrawi activism inside Moroccan annexed Western Sahara because this is an issue I've done some research on a few years ago, and I hope will complement what the previous speakers have said. I started working on this topic because I realized that since the beginning of the 2000s, the Western Sahara conflict seemed to be undergoing some sort of territorial reshaping, and the main consequence of this was growing attention, at least growing international attention on what was going on inside the territory under Moroccan control. And this was driven by the rise, the growing prominence of new, what I saw as a new conflict actor, the rise of internal Sahrawi activists, that is to say, human rights, pro-independence groups based inside the territory annexed by Morocco. I don't think that they're coming to the fore as an increasingly relevant conflict actor has been by no means inevitable, or I don't believe this is a necessary consequence of a monolithic Sahrawi national identity that wouldn't change over time. I think this has been the product of very complex, contingent political processes, and that the formation of the identity of this actor or these actors has been based on struggles for recognition motivated by experiences of disrespect that have elicited responses from mainly three significant others. The Moroccan state in the first place, because this is the annexing state or the occupying state, the Sahrawi state in exile or partially in exile, the Sahrawi Republic led by the Polisario Front, and finally the international community. So I'd like to trace briefly a bit of the process whereby these actors emerge and relate this to different forms of recognition they have achieved from this recognition or misrecognition they have achieved from these three significant others. First of all, I think it is very important to talk about what I call thin cognitive recognition that the Sagrawi activists started to get from the Moroccan state and the international community back in the 90s. And it is very important to keep in mind how the situation in this territory was like in the previous decade, since the beginning of the conflict. These Sahrawi nationalists inside the occupied territory were simply not supposed to exist. Half or about half of their fellow people had fled into exile, and the territory had become virtually isolated because at the time there were no internet, mobile phones, and so on. So the territory was really heavily isolated. And the Moroccan state acted as though no Sahrawi nationalist was left inside the territory. And at the same time, these Sahrawis were also invisible for the international community and to some extent politically sidelined by the Polisario Front and the Sadr, by the Sahrawi leadership in exile. So how did this start to change? In the beginning of the 90s, the first step towards cognitive recognition that these people, these political actors existed, was in fact Morocco's first ever release of Sahrawi political prisoners and disappeared. These disappeared people were held in Moroccan secret detention centers. They were not supposed to exist. So by releasing them, there was an acknowledgement that they existed, in fact. And this group of Sahrawis started to constitute their identity as an embryonic conflict actor, as in the first place, victims of the Moroccan state, human rights victims. And they created in 1994 the first informal grouping that was called the Coordination Committee of Sahrawi Victims of Enforced Disappearance or Disappearances. So that was a first step. Secondly, in the late 90s, we started to see growing protests inside the Western Sahara territory and growing coverage from the Moroccan press, the so-called independent press that was very active in Morocco at the time, much more active than nowadays, and also from the international media. The 1999 protests in Laayoune were very important in this regard. So that was another step toward recognizing that there was something going on politically there. Thirdly, we had the so-called Sagrawi Intifada in 2005 That was a quantitative and a qualitative leap because of the size, the level of mobilization, organization, duration of the protests, but also because politically they involved an overuse of national and pro-independence symbols, which were not at present in previous protests. So from this moment onwards, there was no way for either the international community or the Moroccan state to ignore the fact that there was some important political activism and nationalism there. Actually, I think that rather than the Moroccan state as such, the Intifada of 2005 was more important for the recognition that these actors gained from the two other significant others from the international community, because, among other things, in 2005, the internet already played an instrumental role in disseminating images of the brutal crackdown on Sahrawi protesters and so on. And from also the Polisario front and the Saddle, which sort of realized the internal actors' political potential in a moment of a really critical moment of diplomatic deadlock and frustration that Jacob has very well described. So this is the first type of recognition, which I call thin cognitive recognition. Then we have the recognition of rights from Morocco as the annexing state to Sahrawis. This was the first open struggle for recognition. The Sahrawi activists engaged in fighting for two things: fighting for freedom of association, and for the Moroccan state's accountability and reparation of the gross human rights violations that had been committed throughout the conflict. And the Moroccan state responded with a number of rights-based recognition measures directed towards the entirety of the Sahrawi population of the territory, but as Moroccan citizens or Moroccan subjects, not as Sahrawis, of course. So the first step was the establishment of an independent arbitration committee in 1999, following the first big protests in Laayoune. Then in 2004, the Moroccan state set up what they presented as a transitional justice commission, of course, a very problematic one. And the Sahrawis were very active. Almost 1/4 of the complainants that presented complaints to this commission were Sahrawis. This didn't work out well because in the end there were no public hearings in Western Sahara. The one that was supposed to take place in Laayoune was eventually cancelled. There was no collective preparation for the Sahrawis. There were collective reparations for other regions in Morocco, but not for Western Sahara. So as you can see, a very mixed and sort of counterproductive type of rights-based recognition. Then another type of recognition that the Moroccan state has used strategically, instrumentally, is the recognition of difference. This is part of the Moroccan reconciliation policies, so-called reconciliation policies that have been put in place with the aim of winning the hearts and minds of Sahrawi population as a whole. And these policies have put a lot of emphasis on the particularity of the Saharan/Sahrawi/Hassaniya identity, but very, very importantly, always depoliticizing this identity, construing this identity in exclusively cultural, linguistic, folkloric, and very, very apolitical terms. And the main way in which this type of recognition of difference has been implemented has been through institution building by promoting institutions such as the CORCAS, the Royal Consultative Council for Saharan Affairs, that was created in 2005-6, following the Sagrawi Intifada. This Moroccan institutions were used to co-opt some Sahrawi elite individuals, and this is how the recognition of difference was supposed to take place. Finally, because I think I'm running out of time, I think it's important to look at what the other actors have done. The other two significant others, the Polisario Front, together with the Southern and the international community. The Polisario Front, I think, and we have some representatives here who will be able to correct me if I'm wrong, I think that they have also stepped up the recognition of internal Sahrawis in terms of equal rights. And the turning point for this was in 2009 with the visit of a delegation, an important delegation of representatives from the occupied territories to the camps. And this was the first official engagement. Of course, there had been contacts always, but this was the first official political engagement that led the Polisario to include delegations of representatives in the subsequent congresses with equal voting rights, with growing prominence. So I think this is important in terms of recognition from the Polisario Front and the Southern. And then the international community has been divided between giving some limited recognition, but somehow growing recognition to the internal Sahrawis in the form of rights through official engagement on the ground. You know that MINURSO has never been mandated with any contact with the local population and any human rights monitoring powers. But still, the presence of MINURSO in Lyon has always attracted interest from local actors. And in addition to this, in the past decade, following the Gedemisic protest and the attempts to extend MINURSO's mandate to human rights monitoring, there was an exceptional inflow of international and UN representatives to the territory. That was quite important for some of the actors there. Something that was really surprising is that in 2012, we had the first ever visit by a UN Secretary General's personal envoy for Western Sahara to Western Sahara proper. So that was Christopher Ross, and that was quite interesting. I think I'm going to stop here. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, you are done. Thank you. Okay, thank you very much, Irene, for your contribution. I would suggest that we, Werner, if you agree, then we put you at the end and take first now just after Irene, Raquel, because she will look into the internal situation of Morocco, and I think this leads nicely to what has been explained to us by Irene. I hope you will accept this.
No problem.
Thank you very much. So then our next speaker will be Dr. Raquel Ojeda Garcia. She is Senior Lecturer of Political Science and Administration at the University of Granada in Spain. And she will, as I've already indicated, talk to us about internal politics of Morocco, which I think is also a topic on which you have done a lot of research and published. Okay, Raquel, the floor is yours, and please, again, mind to watch.
Thank you for inviting me to participate in this panel. For me, it's a pleasure to share with you, with my colleagues, with the audience this evening and this debate. I'm going to focus my presentation on the following elements of the political system of Morocco: the nature of the regime, the political party system, political process, and finally the advanced regionalization process. The main elements of the Moroccan political system after the Arab Spring, the constitutional reform on 2011, and the second victory of the Islamist Party of Justice and Development in 2016 are persistence of authoritarian features despite the democratic hybridization and the accommodation of the political parties to this authoritarian system. After the social and political pressures of the revolts in 2011, the king accepted some concessions collected in the constitutional reform, as the head of government is named by the king from the party winner of the House of Representative elections, and the head of government has only to answer to the parliament. About the political party system, Sagrawi speaks about the relevance and irrelevance of parties. Parties are both irrelevant as far as political power is concerned, regarding the power and the key role of the monarchy, but they are simultaneously relevant in terms of sustaining the nature of the political regime in Morocco. The victory of the Islamist Party of Justice and Development on 2016 elections means the failure of the Party of Authenticity and Modernity, unable to defeat the Islamist Party, and the rise of the other close party to the palace, the National Rally of Independence. The main leader of this former party, Hanoush, a close friend of the king, is named a leader as the leader and promoted for the task of countering the rise of the Islamist party. More specifically, Hanoush's new role became evident when he played the main role in blocking Ben Kiran's attempt to form a government following the last legislative elections, with the blessing of the palace and the support of the Popular Movement Party and the Socialist Union of Popular Forces. Finally, the government was made up of the winner of the elections, but with opposition parties and ministries appointed by the king as Interior and Justice. The reconfiguration of the government in October 2019 as a result of the Party of Progress and Socialism leading the governing coalition has meant that the political parties have lost weight in favor of the independent technocrats. Opposition to the political regime is located in parties and movements outside the political system, mainly the Islamist movement, Justice and Spirituality, and the leftist Democratic Way, the former party with a significant capacity for social mobilization. Regarding political process, we can highlight the next elections should be held this year, 2021, and an electoral reform has been carried out under a strong controversy due to the introduction of a new electoral quotient. The distribution of seats will not be determined by the votes cast, but by the number of registered people in the electoral lists. And that undermines the Islamist Party because it was the most voted party in the three last elections, and raises the high fragmentation of the political party system. The Constitutional Court has rejected the appeal presented by the Party of Justice and Development, the runner party, to the new reform that affects the electoral quotient. Previous methods of control of the electoral results by the Ministry of Interior were gerrymandering or even vote buying. Finally, I'm going to focus in the advanced regionalization. The evaluation of the effective degree autonomy given to the regions in the advancing regionalization law using a model of policy analysis based on 6 criteria: democratization, human and fiscal resources, good governance, transfer of power from a state to regions, tutela, and regional division. I can state that the advanced regionalization neither breaks with the old model of government nor ends the contradiction and gray areas in the Moroccan autonomy plan for Western Sahara. On the contrary, it can be stated that the advanced regionalization constitutes a cut with respect to the provision in the autonomy plan for Western Sahara. Other measures and initiatives which are also part of the Moroccan policy towards Western Sahara are the Economic, Social and Environmental Council's proposal for a new development model for the kingdom's southern provinces and the role of the Gorgas, as Irene said before, integrating the Saharian elites. The diagnosis made by the report published by the Economic and Social Council, this report on the social, political and economic situation in Western Sahara was very critical and highlighted the fact that despite efforts on the part of the Moroccan state and constant injections of money in the form of investments, policies and social issues, assistance, the hope for economic upturn hasn't occurred in the area. The reasons for this failure include a lack of legal security, uncertainty about property rights, and the absence of homogeneous, stable fiscal regulation for economic activity. In other words, the contradictory situation in Western Sahara, which is still considered as non-self-governing territory by the international community, international law, but part of the Moroccan state by Morocco and some its key partners, has created a situation of intense uncertainty that runs counter to both development and economic and political stability in the territory. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Raquel, and a special word of thanks that you had the watch in mind. Thank you. Now, our last contributor is Professor Roof. He is Professor for Political Science at the university, or he was Professor of Political Science at the University of Kassel. And his special area of interest is the Maghreb states, and within this, of course, also Morocco and Western Sahara. Thank you very much for joining us, and Werner, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Manfred. Well, besides the Maghreb, I want to look this evening a little bit at Morocco, because Morocco plays a certain role in Morocco, in Africa, not only in Africa. Besides that, but I think the situation of Morocco in Africa is of some importance, and this for two reasons. After 1960, when most of the African states had become independent, there was the famous resolution 1540 of the General Assembly postulating the independence and the self-determination of the Africans. And the second point is, and I was confirmed to this when I looked a little bit at the literature for preparing this presentation, Morocco still plays again a very, very important role in Africa, not only by its policy, but as well as, well, a servant of imperialist interests. So let me start. I think from the point of view of international law, the question of Western Sahara is extremely clear and simple. The former Spanish colony is a non-self-governing territory. Its future must be determined by its population, and that's it. However, it was, and well, as well, it must be stressed that international law is not just a hobby of a few academics, like for instance, Manfred Hinz. It is a very important element of the cohabitation of people and states on this planet. The rules of this peaceful cohabitation have been laid down in the Charter of the United Nations at the end of the World War, not by incident. And not accidentally, the Charter says that in its preamble that the purpose of the United Nations is to save succeeding generations from the surge of war. The rule of war, binding all the member states on an equal basis, should prevent violent conflict and the law of the strongest. Or to put it in simple terms, the problem we face around the conflict of Western Sahara is the contradiction between international law and the so-called realpolitik, the pursuit of the interests of the stronger without respect of the rules. After more than 15 years of fighting between Morocco and Polisario, a ceasefire was concluded in 1991 with the purpose of organizing a referendum among the population of the Western Sahara, giving the Sahrawi people the choice between integrating Morocco or becoming independent. A strong supporter of this referendum was the Organization of African States, of African Unity at the time, of which the DARS, the Democratic Arab Republic of Sahara, had become a full member in 1980. In protest against the membership of the DARS in the Organization of African Unity, Morocco left this organization in 1984. The OAU transformed itself later into the AU, the African Union, and during the last few years, Morocco realized that this policy of boycotting the African Union led to the country into growing self-isolation in Africa. Therefore, in a massive move, in January 2017, Morocco returned to the organization in which the DARS was and still is a full member. One could say this is the recognition of the DARS. Now, at the same time, Morocco started an economic initiative towards African states south of the Sahara by supporting investments of Moroccan firms, especially on the banking sector, electrification, telecommunications, agriculture, and so on. And beginning in 2020, Morocco started to push African states, most of them, I'm coming back to this, most of them former French colonies, towards the establishment of consulates in the occupied territories, preferably in the coastal city of Dakhla. Actually, some 15 African states have formally established such consulates. And without any doubt, these decisions were facilitated by the recognition of the sovereignty over Western Sahara by the Trump administration at the end of last year. This was the thank you of Donald Trump to the King of Morocco for setting up full diplomatic relations with Israel. The reaction of the overwhelming majority in front of this development and the resumption of war between Morocco and the Polisario in November 2020 was prompted by the decision of the Peace and Security Council of the African Union on March 9, 2021, which clearly supported the DAS and condemned the exploitation of the natural resources of the territory and urged the Security Council of the United Nations to accelerate the process leading to the referendum agreed upon in Resolution 690 of 1991 of the Security Council. In order to evaluate the situation in the region, it is important, I think, to have a look at the Kingdom of Morocco itself. We just heard the presentation by Raquel, and the impact of the war on this country. Morocco is one of the most important clients for sophisticated US and French armaments. Together with its economic policy to Africa, Morocco is as well an important door opener for French and US capital and their investments in Africa. Of particular importance are Morocco's relations with France. Morocco supported France in some of its about 70 military interventions in Africa since 1960, giving them even some African legitimacy by the Moroccan participation in the fighting. Morocco's economic and financial expansion towards Africa is concentrated on the states of the so-called African Financial Community. This is a special construction which France has set up in the Bretton Woods negotiations in 1944, a monetary zone of nowadays 14 states whose currency is guaranteed by the French Central Bank, which is now the European Central Bank. It allows for the free flow of money inside this CFA zone, and France and Europe. At the same time, it stays in control. France is in control of the the so-called Community Financière Africaine. So it is not surprising that among the countries opening consulates in Dakhla, we see above all West African countries who are members of the CFA. Besides this seemingly successful story, one should, however, keep in mind that this war costs Morocco some 110,000 US dollars a day. 150,000 Moroccan soldiers are protecting the 2,700 kilometers of wall in the Sahara. Basic goods in the occupied territories are highly subsidized. Business is exempted from taxes. Public servants in these territories receive the double or more of their normal salary. I just referred to what Jeffrey Smith has said. And all this happens while in Morocco itself, 1/5 of the population lives below the level of absolute poverty. The king is the 7th richest monarch of the world, according to Forbes. His private wealth amounts about $2 billion, while the cost of his palaces, which must be nearly $1 million a day, is paid by the state. Looking at all these discrepancies and at the social unrest in the country, as seen during the Arab Spring or the recent uprising of the Iraq in the Rif, the stability of the regime seems less solid than it may appear. And the enormous money spent for the war and for the repression of the population in the occupied territories, as well as in Morocco itself, would better be used for the urgent needs of the population. Taking all this together, peace and stability in Morocco, Western Sahara, and West Africa would best be served if the rights of the people in these countries would be respected according to the Charter of the United Nations. This appeal concerns at first France. France, which is a permanent member of the Security Council. France's criticism of blaming the UN for being unable to solve conflict is of utmost cynicism. Preventing the United Nations from proceeding according to the principle of international law, while at the same time pointing to its inefficiency, is not only impedes the just solution of the Western Saharan conflict, it demolishes as well the world's most important institution for maintaining peace and justice. That's why the case of Western Sahara goes, as I think, far beyond the rights of a still colonized people. Just and peaceful international relations will only be possible if they are not ruled by the law of the strongest, but by the strength of the law. Fighting for the right of the Sahrawis means therefore fighting for the rule of law, independently from and against the particular interests of imperial powers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, dear Werner, for your contribution. With this, we have come to the end of the contributions to the first panel. I see a message from Leonie, who is looking at possible questions. That so far nobody has posed a question from the audience who is linked to us via Facebook. But nevertheless, I think we still have some few minutes to discuss the presentations which we had, and I would also open the floor for remarks, questions, statements from the panelists or from all the others who are directly linked to our symposium. Is there anybody who would like to say something, to add a question? There is obviously silence.
Regina würde gerne was fragen.
Oh yeah, yeah.
I would like to ask a question.
Please come in.
Someone was talking about the opening of consulates of former French colonies. My question is, would all these countries who opened a consulate in the occupied territory have officially declared that Western Sahara is part of Morocco? Or would they have just opened up a building, put up a flag, and that's it? That is a question that I have since long.
Thank you. Werner, maybe you have an answer?
Well, I guess it's a question which concerns me. Regina, you are right. Setting up buildings, putting up flags, who cares? But I think in international law, this means more. This means having a representation, an official representation in a contested territory. So this is taking clearly the side of one of the parties, in this case of the occupier. It's not just fun putting a flag there.
Maybe I can add one or two sentences. Werner, you have mentioned in your presentation the recent decision of the African Union, in which there is an interesting point, namely the resolution calls for a legal opinion to the Secretary General of the United Nations a legal opinion on the opening of these consulates. So we will. It will be very interesting to see whether the Security Council or the Secretary General will follow this and what the result will be. I can add that we had, at least to my knowledge, a similar case when Namibia was still under South African occupation. At that time, we had a kind of consulate of Germany in Windhoek, and there was a lot of debate about this. While on the one side there was this consulate, but on the other side there was also a clear position, somehow clear position of Germany that Southwest Africa at the time was not part of South Africa. I think this is is somehow a gray area when it comes to international law. I see Jeffrey nodding or shaking his head. Maybe Jeffrey, you have a word on this as well.
Well, very briefly, the duty of non-recognition. I mean, we look to put this activity, these actions, and the evidence is becoming clear that it's been promoted or fostered by Morocco as occupier, the holding out of the facility that they are in Dakhla is itself a part of that phenomenon. But it's the duty of non-recognition of an illegal occupation, too difficult for much of the international community to contend with, but also the very kind of clear overarching right of self-determination. So they would come together to, if you will, prohibit this. I think we can get to a fairly clear answer. The problem is it lacks precedent, really. The international community under the UN Charter has comported itself in a very much a kind of non-recognition way around a number of occupied territories until quite recently. We complain about Russia in the Crimea, and yet it's countries of the global north who are facilitating this in other places.
Okay, thank you, Jeffrey. I see that Tim Güllemann has placed a question. Is there any opening or flexibility from the Sahrawi side towards any kind of an autonomy solution? I don't know who would like to respond to this. Irene, could you say something on this?
Yeah, maybe. I don't think we can talk about the Sahrawis as a whole without having opinion polls, or so it's really hard to give an answer to that question. I think we'll have to make a difference between Sahrawis who are clearly pro-independence nationalists and those who might be in a gray area or happy with belonging to Morocco. We don't know the figures. I mean, the evidence we have is that back in 2003, when Morocco had the chance of holding a referendum with a very favorable census, because the Baker Plan 2 provided for all people living in the territory to vote, they refused the plan, as Jacob has said, because there was a clear fear in Morocco that the result of the referendum would be in favor of independence, including people, including settlers or people of Moroccan origin living in the territory. Other than this, we don't have any opinion polls. We don't have, I don't know if Jacob or anyone else knows anything that's been conducted recently. I'm not aware of anything like this. I would say the autonomy plan as such has already been there for 15 years, and it's clearly seen as integration. There isn't a sense that autonomy would amount, as the Moroccans conceive it, there isn't any sense that this would amount to self-rule or any meaningful form of internal self-determination. So I don't think the majority of Sahrawis who support self-determination would be happy with what the Moroccans call autonomy.
Okay, thank you very much.
By the way, a bit of an empty signifier. We don't know what it really means in practice. We haven't seen any developments. So it's always a word or a motto that's repeated, but there's little substance.
Okay, thank you very much. I think there's one comment in the chat box which correctly says that we might come back to this question in the last panel, and would in particular expect the representative of Frente Polisario to say something on this. Now, I see that there are now quite a number of questions. Let me just read them out, and then we must see how we can deal with them and conclude as soon as possible, because we have already exhausted the time given to us. Where do you see the position of the African Union, and what opportunities would an African Union's intervention provide? Where do you see the position of the African Union, and what, okay, there's a repetition. Then okay, this is, I just responded to this. I would like to say, okay, Isabel Lorenzo would like to say something about the consulates. Okay. Okay, I think that's it. That's the main point about the African Union's intervention. Werner, could you say something on this, please?
Yes. Well, I think that this declaration of the African Peace and Security Council is very important and gives clearly a position which strengthens the DARS and the Polisario. However, I think, why didn't they ask themselves for the legal opinion? They could have done it. We all know that the Security Council is what it is. And in this case, he is largely determined by France. So I think the position of the OAU is to some extent getting a little bit back from the conflict, not being anymore in the first front and well, defending the DARS at any price. Maybe, and hopefully I am wrong, maybe some people or some representative of the Polisario see this differently, because they have as well, I think, the diplomatic insight of what is going in the African Union.
Okay, thank you, Werner. Now, Isabel, just 2 sentences on consulate.
Okay, good afternoon. Regarding the consulates, it's like always, it's a marketing tool. Morocco is expert in marketing their foreign politics and the occupation. It's a marketing tool and not more than that. We had opening of consulate, but nobody is speaking about the closure of consulates, because Morocco always promises the countries that open consulates counterparties. It's like I don't know, hospital, some scholarships for foreign students, African students, some work, whatever, which never happens. We have several examples with Guinea-Bissau, which was promised a hospital, and the king arrived in Guinea-Bissau, and the president at the time exited his palace and put the Moroccan flag instead of the Guinea-Bissau flag in the palace. And at the end, he received one little room inside the hospital, like 5 or 6 beds. So it is what it is. So what concerns the autonomy plan, how can the Sahrawi believe in an autonomy plan when Morocco does not respect one single covenant, agreement, a convention, ceasefire, military agreement, whatever, all over these years? But this is a question that has not been to be answered by us, and not even by the representatives of Frente Polisario, but by the Polisario people at the poll. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Isabel. I think with this, I would like to conclude this first panel. Thank you to everybody who has participated, the contributors, and also those who have placed in questions. So now I give back to Judith just to say how we proceed, because we have certainly overtaken the time given to us.